Okay.
So both the president and Bundy convinced LBJ. And then Bundy came back and called me up and said, "You're going to go to the Middle East with the vice president." I said, "Oh, God, I don't even know the vice president." Well, he said, "You're going to get to know him well." And he described this story to me, and I knew there was no recourse, since the president was obviously with him. So Bundy said, "You better get over and meet the vice president. I've arranged for you to go over at 2 this afternoon." I said, "That's only in a couple of hours. Let's go." So I began calling up around town to find out about Lyndon Johnson. Because everybody was scared to death of him. And I went over at 2 to the majority leader's office. And I want to tell you, it was a lot bigger than the president's office. It was chandeliers. It was 3 stories high. And there's a huge conference table in it. And down at the far end of the conference table was sitting what looks like the vice president. And up at this end of the conference table was my friend Phil Talbot. Well, I walked down to the other end, reported to the vice president. He said, "Look, I'm having an argument with your friend down there at the other end, the State Department." And it was about the Pakistanis. It happened to be an argument about the one issue on which Talbot and I had had words. I happened to agree with the vice president. Well, the vice president said, "What do you think about this?" Well, I said, "You happen to have picked the one issue that Phil Talbot and I have had an argument on. And I agree. I think we should do ABC." He said, "That's just what I've been telling him." So we became friends right off. We got on the airplane. Kennedy knew how to send off a vice president. He's getting rid of him for 3 weeks. We had a helicopter departure from the Rose Garden right outside the Oval Office. And LBJ loved him. Kennedy came out to see him off. The whole cabinet was there and everybody else. And Mac had told me to bring my family. So my family went down. It was the first time they'd been in the cabinet room or the Rose Garden. And they all watched as the vice president and I were loudly praised by the president. We walk over, get in the helicopter, and take off. First time I'd ever left the Rose Garden. Not the last. But as soon as the plane got airborne, buzzed beside my seat, my vice president says, "Come in, I want to talk to you." So I went in, sits me down. He said, "I know you Harvard boys." He said, "You guys are ruining the country." He said, "But I want to ask you just one question. Why are you Harvard boys supporting India and neglecting our stalwart friends, the Pacs and General Ayub?" Well, he couldn't have asked me a question on which I had more strong views. Well, I gave them to him. I said, "I want to put it very simply, the way I did to the president. There are 100 million Pacs and 650 million Indians. Now, from the standpoint of the interest of the United States, are we going to back 100 million Pacs against 650 million Indians?" He said, "Well, I understand what you're saying, but I don't see why we couldn't be a little more sophisticated about it." I said, "If we try to get sophisticated, we screw ourselves with Pacs and Indians." And we had a discussion, and I went away feeling I may not have sustained his friendship, but boy, I really had a chance to let him have it, and I did. And he remembered that. And he pursued the policy I wanted, and Mac wanted, on subcontinental affairs.
What country did you visit, Wisconsin, on this? Pakistan? And
We went to Lebanon. From Lebanon to Tehran. From Tehran to Ankara. Ankara to Istanbul. Istanbul to Cyprus. And Cyprus to Rome.
This is your first time in Iran, this visit? Wisconsin.
I can't recall whether I had gone there previously. I went out to Pakistan with Walt Rostow. And he came directly back, and I came back through Tehran and stopped off for a weekend because I wanted to see Shiraz, where the nightingales sing in the bulbul trees, and Persepolis. I saw that, Dahti Rustam, those tombs, you know, the cliffside. God, I had a good time. And then Julius Holmes, who had wanted me out of town, so it worked like a charm. He gave me the chief of station to fly me down to Shiraz in a private airplane. God, I got sick. But, and that was the redoubtable Gratian Yatsevich.
Well, CIA station.
Yeah. But I got back in time to have dinner with Julius, who served a brace of wild duck that he had just shot that weekend on the Caspian. God, he had a good cook, and boy, those were good duck. It was a splendid evening, and Julius Holmes was regally hospitable. And I told him I had written the history of his World War II exploits. He was very pleased, but we got along famously. But he sure got me out of town the next morning at 6 a.m. after sleeping in a very good bed in the embassy. But anyway.
Well, when does the visit with Johnson, when did that occur? Early 63 or?
No, I think it was 62.
62?
I think it was 62.
Okay.
But I can tell you 100 stories about that trip. But I'd sum it up by saying that I had established a very good rapport with Lyndon Johnson. He wrote me a letter afterwards in which he said, I hear that you want to be known as the man who said no to Lyndon Johnson. Well, I want to be known as the man who listened to Bob Komer. And thanks for all your help, Lyndon Johnson. Then invited me out to the Vice President's house several times, invited me down to his office. I was the one member, I think, of the Kennedy staff who had a good rapport with the Vice President, and I always cultivated it. The Johnson staff generally, and the Kennedy staff generally, did not think much of LBJ, and he was uncomfortable with them. So there wasn't that much dealing. The most of the dealing was at the President, Vice President level. But I kept LBJ informed. You know, when I sent memos to the President, if they were the kind that I could afford to send to the Vice President, I did. I sent him a blind copy. Then, with the assassination, I was in like Flynn. I was one of the first people he invited over to see him, and I wasn't even a special assistant. No, I was just an NSC staff member. And it was onward and upward with LBJ, because he sent me to Vietnam, for which I was not grateful. But I did all right by him there, too. Why don't we get back to your questions?
Okay, all right. Well, back to the trip to Iran, though, with President Johnson, did you meet with the Shah at that point?
I did indeed.
Yeah.
And when the Shah made available some of his special golden caviar for us to take back, I signed up for 2 kilos. And when I got back, we put them in the plane's icebox. When I got back, I found that they had been delivered to the Vice President's house by the Secret Service, which had gone through the plane and taken out everything that they thought was the Vice President and sent it off his way. Well, I felt very unhappy about that. So I talked to the Secret Service guy, and he said, well, that's tough, David. It's gone. We're not going to go to the Vice President's house. Well, I happen to know the head of the Secret Service, who ate in the White House mess with me. And that noon, I talked to him. Oh, he said, we'll get it. That guy didn't give you a very good answer. I said, make him go out and raid the icebox. Well, he said, we'll take care of it. So there are some Secret Service men on detail out there. They just went to the icebox, got the 2 kilos, and delivered them to my home, where my wife was very grateful. You mind if I put my feet up? You do mind?
No problem. As long, no problem.
I won't kick her.
Yeah, that's the only concern.
Yeah.
During this visit to Tehran with Vice President Johnson, was this your first meeting with the Shah? The first time you met the Shah in person, or?
I think so.
What were your impressions of him?
He was on good behavior, and he was a stern, martial man. He seemed rather impressive. Since LBJ didn't know much about Iran, so I tried to tell him a few things, he did not get into big substantive subjects, which left the Shah a chance to try and influence Lyndon Johnson, which he did. But Johnson knew enough. He's an old pal. He knew enough not to absorb it. But it was a very pleasant thing. The Shah put us up very well, gave us some splendid luncheons and dinners, took us up to the Caspian, the usual thing. We were only there for 2 days, I think, 2.5 days. It was not a very substantive occasion.
Mm-hmm.
Since I was the guy on the White House staff who would have used Lyndon Johnson's visit to deliver messages, I had not come up with any messages. I probably had failed to do my job. But I was feeling at that point still pretty put upon that they had decided to send me off as a sacrificial lamb. It turned out to be the most profitable trip I ever took.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, you sort of indicated this earlier in the interview, but how did administration officials during the Kennedy era, or Johnson era for that matter, define U.S. interests in Iran?
We didn't go in
to what
for that, since we didn't have to write MSC papers anymore. But our interest in Iran was the oil and the access which Iran would give to the Arab states. And we pursued a firmly anti-communist policy, and since the Shah was firmly anti-communist, he was our big buddy. It wasn't until much later that we saw Iran under the Shah as our chosen instrument for the Middle East after the 73 oil crisis and the collapse of Center. At this point, we were just interested in keeping the Soviets out of any country around the Soviet periphery.
Okay.
We did not have a lot of specific interests. There wasn't a lot of American business there. The oil company was, I think, still owned by the Brits.
It was a consortium of British and American firms, and a Dutch firm. Now, I've seen a sanitized copy of the task force report of May 61, and there's some discussion of the measures that the U.S. could take to assure the Shah that the U.S. would act as a guarantor of military stability for Iran. What kind of conclusions did administration officials reach about the steps that they could take, steps they could reasonably take that would satisfy the Shah at the same time?
My memory doesn't serve me very well.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I read your sanitized version, I could do a little better, but I don't recall. At any rate, it worked. We were very pleased with our Iranian policy because the Shah seemed to be getting more popular, and land reforms seemed to be rather successful. And this was a period when, with all the other problems we had, it was a good thing that Iran was getting more stable rather than less so.
In general, what was the importance of military aid in U.S. policy towards Iran? What did the U.S. think it would get out of giving military assistance?
Very high.
Yeah.
The U.S. saw the military aid dollar as buying us a lot more influence with the Shah than an economic aid dollar. The Shah was fascinated by the military, thought of himself as a latter-day field marshal, and really took a great personal interest in all things military. So resolved a lot of issues himself. Now, secondarily, military aid was seen as shoring up a strong quasi-ally who had a common border with the Soviet Union. We had, by this time, created the Baghdad Pact, Nouri had disappeared as Prime Minister of Iraq, and so had the king, which made Iran even more important. And it was adjacent to Turkey. The Pax and the Turks were strong supporters of Iran. So military aid was seen by us as strengthening the alliance which we had created, part of the containment alliance against the Soviet Union. Remember, as long as we had this quasi-alliance, remember the Americans never joined the Baghdad Pact. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, that is probably a good thing. But military aid was very important, and we never really questioned the fact of military aid. We had a lot of questions about the size, and so did the Shah. So it was a constantly active dialogue with him asking for things. I remember one time when he asked for a tank that we didn't even know about. I mean, none of the people, Talbot didn't know, Grant didn't know, I didn't know. So I called up a friend of mine who was a colonel in the Ordnance Department, and I said, what in the hell is the M48A5 tank? So he said, how did you know about that? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we've only got 2 of them. They're experimental models. It's a product improvement of the M48, A3. And I don't know, so I told him who had requested them. I said, we don't know how the Shah found out about this. He must have been reading Army Ordnance, the magazine. Well, I said, I can give you an alternative explanation. He asked the Israelis what tank he should order, and the Israelis told him. One guy said, how do the Israelis know? I said, because they know everything that goes on in the Pentagon, because you guys don't know who the hell you're talking to. And it's true. If I ever wanted to know what was going on in the Pentagon, I could ask the Israelis, and they would be happy to do so. They owe us. But, no, military aid was quite important.
Did you just participate in discussions on economic aid as well?
Yeah.
How would you characterize the general approach that the policymakers took towards economic aid?
Same as with military, basically. These were instruments of influence. And we tried to use them in constructive ways to promote the modernization of Iran. We bankrolled land reform to a certain extent, as an example.
What kind of an Iranian society did you and your colleagues hope that aid would promote?
A stable society that would be increasingly able to meet the aspirations of the Iranian people. I don't think we were trying to create a developed country or anything like that. Some aid people may have had special axes to grind, but in Talbot's mind and mine, it was just keeping Iran stable and modernizing.
Was there some interest in trying to find ways to develop a sort of more or less modern middle class?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It wasn't all that easy. Iran does have a modern middle class. I don't know how modern it is. I guess you'd include the Bazaris in the middle class, and I think they're a throwback.
Now, around the time that the task force was deliberating, back in May '61, the Shah appointed Ali Amini, who you mentioned earlier, appointed him as prime minister. Was there any U.S. role in the Shah's decision to appoint Amini?
I don't think so.
Because I asked because when I interviewed Harold Saunders, he said he had a strong impression that the U.S. had a role in encouraging the Shah to appoint Amini or somebody like him.
Hal may be right. Hal didn't go to any of these task force sessions.
He wasn't there then, I don't think. I think he was still at CIA.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But they read all the state cables, which didn't always tell the whole story. Because most of the state didn't know it. But let me simply say this. I do not recall the U.S. having much role in the appointment of Ali Amini. But at the same time, Hal may be right. We didn't have a very forceful ambassador there. I don't think we knew that much about it. I mean, that book.
I read that Kennedy knew him somewhat because he was ambassador to the U.S. in the 50s. I mean, and then was with the World Bank.
Yeah, come in.
Well, you were mentioning earlier that the U.S. is trying to find ways to encourage economic modernization and social modernization. To what extent was there interest at this time in encouraging political modernization, trying to develop, encouraging the Shah to develop modern political institutions that would last, that would outlive him?
Well, that's always one of the objectives of the State Department. They did it in Iran, in Vietnam when I was there, in the States. But that was one of our objectives. We did promote, a majlis. What do they call it?
No majlis, the parliament.
Yeah. And giving it greater power. The Shah was a bit of an absolutist. He always wanted to keep things in his hands. And we didn't get very far, but that was not a dominant motif of our policy. I would say that, the idea of containing the Soviet Union had a lot more to do with our operative policy than almost anything else.
Okay.
And the Shah played on that adroitly.
I've read that after Kennedy's Vienna summit meeting with Nikita Khrushchev in June '61, somewhere about there. Kennedy returned to the U.S. with some apprehension about the Iran situation. I think Khrushchev made some comment about Iran falling like a ripe apple or something like that.
Yeah.
Do we recall a discussion of that? Or?
We were asked what we thought about it, and we didn't take it all that seriously because we couldn't find any physical evidence that the Russians were doing anything. But I think Khrushchev was really using Iran as a good example of what he could do around the Soviet periphery. And that made us nervous not just about Iran, but other places which we thought were a good deal weaker.
Okay.
But it contributed to this general motivation that I described. We were proud of being pragmatists. I was less pragmatic than some, but I tried to keep my eye on what I thought would influence our policy rather than trying to achieve the impossible in 3 short years.
Now, earlier we were talking a little bit, we were talking about the efforts to scale down the size of the Iranian army, and from what I've read, in April '62, the NSC approved a 5-year plan of military aid that tied military aid to scaling down of the Shah's army. Do you recall any role that you might have had in shaping that plan?
Frankly, I don't recall the plan.
Yeah.
Not that it couldn't have existed. That the NSC approved something like that surprises me. The President had a very good grasp of the essence of the NSC, which is that it's all advisory. The President makes the decisions, the NSC can advise him to stand on his head if it wants to.
Well, with NSC paper, maybe, I'm not sure if it was a formal NSC meeting to approve it. I'm not sure about there's a distinction, obviously, but it was NSC paper with a number and so forth. Now, apparently there was a fair amount of planning for the Shah's visit in April '62. Did you take part in the discussions of that? Do you recall anything disliking about it?
That the NSC guys always had to do, that was pay a lot of attention to visits. Because who was being visited? The President of the United States. Who were you working for? The President of the United States. So, usually, the State Department would produce a great big massive briefing book, and then a great big massive backup book with documents and cables and stuff like that. We used to get regular presidential complaints that these books were terrible. So Bundy and I and a couple of others talked about it and made the decision, for Christ's sake, don't send the goddamn books to the President. read the books, distill the essence, add what you yourself want to say, and write the president a short memo, 2 or 3 or 4 pages. It's an important visit. Tell him what the issues are. Tell him what you think he ought to say. Then, if you want, add in at the end. I have in my office a large State Department briefing book, and if you want to see it, just say so, or we'll send it right over. I do not recall a president ever asking to see the State Department briefing book. Of course, he had to see the arrival statement, the toast, the dinner statement, the speeches, or whatever, the talking points. But generally, we incorporated the talking points that we wanted and left out the rest. Didn't send them to him. The state version. I found Kennedy very receptive to that. He had more trust in me than he did in the State Department. Not Russ, but the Middle East guy. It always worked out. Johnson was the same thing, except that Johnson, when he first came in, was a little nonplussed at the informal ways of his NSC staff. And of Bundy, we did our best to treat Johnson just like we treated Kennedy. He was not the same guy, and usually asked more questions than the other things. But soon he became happy with what we did. There were some adjustments made. And Johnson was never really fully confident and trusting of Mac Bundy. Kennedy had known Bundy, Johnson did not know Bundy, and besides which he was a Harvard boy, etc. I was about the only guy in whom he had full personal confidence. Not that I was a genius, but that I had had this rapport with him from the trip. And he sure argued with me enough. My last big thing as the deputy NSC assistant was the Great Indian Famine and the visit of Indira Gandhi in 65 or 66. And boy, he gave me a hard time on sending food to India. Not that he didn't want to send food, but he sure as hell didn't want to waste leverage by sending it before it was needed. Let the rats eat it. And that was a tough, but that's not Iran.
We were talking about Ali Amini a little bit ago, and there's one thing I didn't pursue. Was there a special effort to put pressure on him to pursue a line of reform? Or was there more
Not pressure. I don't think we were dumb enough to pressure.
Yeah. Maybe pressure is too strong a word to use. But,
We tried, but we didn't have the kind of rapport and dealings with the domestic ministers in Tehran that we did with the Shah or with the army or with the military. Our aid didn't go directly to the prime minister or anything else. So we talked with them, we wrote them letters. The ambassador usually did that. And yes, we tried to offer our 2 cents worth to advise him on things we thought were dangerous or injudicious. But basically it was his program, and his problems were with the Shah. The Shah did not like us giving widespread gratuitous advice to his people. And we were generally pretty careful about that. There are some countries where, we run the prime minister, we write his speeches, etc., etc. Iran was not one of them.
I've gotten the sense that there was, and maybe in the first year of the Kennedy administration, there was some effort to sort of induce the Shah to move on reforms. You talked about that, but was this, I guess pressure is too strong a word, but was it sort of subtle diplomatic hints that he should do certain things, or how was this
on what
done?
Score?
In terms of internal reforms, land reform and so forth.
Yes, we communicated a lot with the Shah on internal reforms, and I did not hesitate to put in the presidential correspondence specific policy advice. We were all for land reform, and we pressed the Shah on land reform. We didn't pressure him all that much because he was a volatile character, and we didn't want him to decide that the Americans were more of a pain in the ass than their aid was worth. And he didn't yield all that much, but on the other hand, he's susceptible.
Now, in late '62, the Shah announced the White Revolution program and submitted it to a national referendum, I think.
The Shah kicked out Ali Amini and appropriated Amini's program, which I thought was pretty shitty at the time. What can you do about it?
Was there any effort to sort of support Amini's position, or was that just...
Yes, we tried to very politely indicate to the Shah we thought Amini was the greatest thing since ice cream. But he'd made up his mind.
So Holmes approached him with that...
Oh, you know, in conversation. We were very careful on that. And it turned out pretty well. Arsenjani was the agriculture minister.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. You had said that, and I had
I was
said
close.
no.
I think I said Rossington.
That's right.
Yeah,
You did.
yeah.
Arsenjani.
That's right.
He was a tough little turkey.
I've seen the document suggested that Arsenjani pushed fairly hard on land reform, and the Shah removed him from power. The document I've seen suggested that there was some interest in the U.S. and press getting the Shah to move against Arsenjani, because there was some concern in the U.S. that pushing land reform too hard would be destabilizing in some respects.
There might well have been.
Yeah, but
the agency had its own policy, and you never knew what the hell the agency was doing. You only knew what they told you. And the State Department sometimes didn't come fully clean.
Because the CIA had its own purposes in Iran at some
No, it was supposed to be supporting. It was supporting, but we had a very influential CIA presence.
Yatsevic.
Yeah. Julius Holmes came out and said there can't be two ambassadors here, and fired Yatsevic, or relieved him. And I was strongly opposed to that. I thought any sensible ambassador would certainly want links to the Shah and others that Yatsevic had. He was a personal friend of the Shah. So I would have brought him in and said, "You're working for me, buddy, and here's what I want you to tell him, and I don't want to catch you going off on your own anywhere." But I had problems with the agency. Jim Critchfield was the agency man who handled, he was the Middle East guy there. He and I were old friends, worked well together, but I never was confident that I knew more than half of what he was playing around with. And we had some run-ins on Nasser. He thought Nasser, the best thing to do with Nasser was eliminate him. I didn't think much of that.
I had a sense that during the 50s, the CIA had a fairly dense network of Iranian agents in Tehran and elsewhere. By the early 60s, do you have a sense that that was still the case, or was there...
I don't think that we cut back a lot between the 50s and 60s, which makes me think your 50s thing was overdone. I don't think they had a dense network, but they were well connected. We used SAVAK, the Iranian Internal Security Service, and CIA, and we practically, no, I won't say we created SAVAK, but we provided it with an awful lot of assistance, specialized equipment and stuff like that, and we felt in return that they were going to give us a lot of information, which they did. Sometimes it was information that they had concocted for us.
Was that understood at the time, that it was unreliable?
No, I think we got to be more tied up with SAVAK than we really should have. But it wasn't that important. It wasn't important.
This is through the 60s, basically. Yeah.
We did later cut back on our establishment. It's been a mistake. It blinded us at the wrong time.
The cut back on the CIA's presence for the political officers.
That's right. That was in the 70s.
That's right. Now, in terms of back to the White Revolution for a little bit.
Yep.
I seen a memo from during the spring of '63 that you wrote that suggested that you and Kenneth Hansen in the Budget Bureau were concerned the Shah was not moving fast enough on a reform program or in expanding the economy. There was a recession at this point in Iran. In the memo, you further suggested that Ambassador Holmes, the State Department generally, was taking sort of a passive approach to the problem, and you urged a more active, somewhat interventionist approach to reform. Do you recall why you thought that the State Department course was somewhat perilous or misguided?
I vaguely remember the episode you refer to. I can't for the life of me remember what triggered it.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been Hansen. Ken was always sparking like this. One old line agency or other wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, etc. He may have convinced me.
It was in the context of a discussion over an INISM paper that was on Iran that was produced by the State Department. I think there might have been a reaction to that, to the tone of the document.
They always wrote crappy papers.
State Department.
Yeah. Too bland, too cautious, too prudent. To be useful.
Well, let's give you a couple more questions and we can wrap it up for now. In June '63, there were major anti-Shah demonstrations that broke out in a number of cities, Tehran and elsewhere. And the Shah responded with military repression, which led to some loss of life. And Ayatollah Khomeini was a major figure in these demonstrations against the Shah. Now, do you recall if the NSC staff or you held any special discussions of these developments at that time in mid-'63, or how you interpreted these developments at the time?
I'm a blank on that one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember these things. You're 20 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Now, also in '63, or perhaps early '64, the U.S. and Iran held joint military exercises in Iran, which involved the movement of sizable numbers of U.S. troops into Iran in cooperation with the Iranian military. Do you recall anything about that exercise?
Wasn't that a Santo exercise?
It may well have been.
Yeah.
It may well have been.
We would have wanted reasonably good political cover for that because the Russians might have gotten nervous. But beyond that, I don't recall.
What its purpose might have been, or
well, we tried to do that in a lot of places. I noticed we're conducting an exercise with the Congolese down in Shaba, where there's a big airfield, and I'm sure that we decided, haven't done this for 15 years, we better do something like that. Or the locals asked for it or something. But I don't remember the specifics about this.
Okay.